everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Zymposium, where we are continuing to work through our series on building better open source. So we took a few weeks off due to LambdaConf, and LambdaConf was a blast, tremendous success, so much energy and excitement at the event. And I got a chance to speak with dozens and dozens of people across many languages and technologies, covering functional programming, systems programming, distributed programming, durable execution, cool technologies like WebAssembly. Had a blast there. But I am definitely excited to be back leading this series and hopefully covering ways we can use different techniques and concepts and attention to developer experience to build better open source projects. So today's session looks a bit light. Do we have any volunteers to dive into some open source project, new or existing? Oh, I disabled chat accidentally, or rather I did not enable it. Let me go ahead and fix that problem real fast. And all right, there we go. All right, fantastic. You should be able to chat now. So any volunteers for an open source project this week? Any language, any tech stack? Why not? Why not? All right, so Tushar, good to see you. You want to dive into tail call? Okay, since we don't have any other takers, let's go ahead and promote you to panelist. This should be fun. We get some Rust on the show for a change. Hello.
Hey, John.
Hey, good to see you. It's going well.
Same here, absolutely.
Is it a sane hour for you?
It's 9:30 p.m.
Okay. It could be worse.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for spending your evening to join me. And crew.
Yeah, I've been planning to attend this for a while, but this time I was able to finally.
Well, welcome. So we're going to take a look at tail call, are we?
Sure.
All right, fantastic. You want to share your screen?
Oh, okay. All right. Give me a sec. Nice.
And I don't know if you caught any prior episode, but basically what we do on this show is we're looking for ways to build better open source. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be technical, although it usually is. It can also be, how can we talk about this thing? How can we market it? How can we build a community around an open source project? Or it could be more like, how should we structure this API so that a developer could use it? Or how can we change the architecture to be more generally applicable or performant or whatever it is?
Got it. I have multiple things that I'd like to pick your brains on.
Yes.
So let me just quickly, talk about some of the things that I'd need help in. So one is performance. So we want to work on performance. This is a Rust-based project, but we still have areas where we can kind of optimize in terms of performance, right?
Yes.
The second thing, I think, just the documentation and just how do you use the product is sort of not clear. Just the positioning needs a little bit of work. I think the third thing is there's one very interesting feature that we've been kind of thinking about, which is query planning. And I can talk about this
very
in
fun.
a little bit of detail. Yeah, this is
before we continue. Baldwin asks, and I think this is great context for the broader audience here who will watch on YouTube, is what is tail call? What's the elevator pitch for tail call? So people know what we're looking at.
Sure. So basically, when you're building APIs in your backend system, you build a lot of APIs. The consumers on the front end, which are consuming these APIs. Typically, there's always a gap between what an ideal API should look like for that use case versus what is built. So there's this sort of impedance mismatch between these APIs. So for example, you're building a social network and you've got a posts API. So it's just giving you a list of posts and probably some information, a user ID about that post, right? You don't have the user information in that API. If I'm building a rich user interface, I want to show posts, I want to show user information, I want to show the comments on the post, I want to show the avatars and the images, the likes. So there's a lot of meta information that I have to sort of orchestrate on the client itself. So this is a lot of work on the client. I have to replicate that logic across an Android app, an iOS app, web app, all those kind of things. So an ideal API for that use case would be an API that gives me everything at once, right? And that doesn't exist. And that doesn't exist because as platform engineers, we want to make things which are generalized, an API which is a general purpose API, right? So if I'm building a user API, for example, I'm exposing information which is probably personally identifiable information. I'm exposing emails and phone number, all those kind of things. But when I'm exposing, if I use the same API on the client, I have a problem there because I'm now exposing a lot of data. So there's this gap between what the API really is and how the ideal API. And this API keeps the ideal API keeps on evolving. Because every time there's a new UI, there's a new feature, this API sort of changes.
Yeah.
This constant tussle between the platform engineering teams which are building these APIs and the front end teams probably using these APIs, right?
Yeah.
And a typical solution for this is sort of either you orchestrate on the front end, you figure it out, it's a front end problem, let them figure this out, or you build a layer in between. And
The
that's
back end for the
typically
front end type of
the
concept where you
backend
have a
for the
separate, yeah.
exactly,
Okay.
right? So and backend for front end works well. However, it's a pain to manage. It's
Yeah.
inefficient. It's extremely difficult to scale because now you've put one layer in between, so you don't know one request can fan out to thousands. They could be n plus ones. It's extremely hard to kind of manage the
Yeah.
backend for front end layer if you write it by hand. Right? You could use Vue, you could use a lot of declarative style of programming. You could get a lot of those benefits, but instead, what AILCall sort of proposes is you use a DSL that helps you compose APIs, and then ahead of time it does a ton of optimizations, right?
Yeah.
And then automatically builds a unified endpoint to kind of compose all these APIs. So there's just one endpoint, and you can query everything on your in your infrastructure, right? Every
Yeah.
API that is there, you can just quickly query, right? The protocol that it uses is primarily GraphQL. So the endpoint that is exposed is a GraphQL endpoint. Though you can convert that GraphQL to a REST or a gRPC, you can do all
Mhm.
those kind of things. But essentially, think about it as a GraphQL endpoint that is being generated over existing APIs.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. So tail call allows you to avoid creating this sort of back end for the front end, creating this intermediate layer that sort of ties together lots of different APIs and packages up all the information needed by the front end and no more in a way that allows
Yeah,
constant evolution and maintenance and versioning and all that stuff that would otherwise take a lot of work to maintain by hand.
right, right,
Okay,
absolutely.
fantastic. I hope that was helpful for those of you listening. And now it looks like you were about to continue maybe with a number four here, or was this the last one?
Um, I think these are the main things. I think
Okay.
instead of documentation, I would say just position.
Yes. Okay.
I'll just
Right.
these are the
So,
three high level things that I'd like
yeah,
to focus
yeah, makes sense. All right. Well, pick one and we will dive into it.
on. How about positioning for today?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you picked a challenging one. Performance and query planning, no problem. Positioning, though. Yeah, positioning, it's really tough. So show us how you position it right now so we can get a feel for what sort of
Sure.
developer it's reaching out to and what sort
Okay.
of pains it's promising a solution to.
Let me actually share my whole screen. Uh,
Sure.
yeah.
I'm interested
It's
if
my
you're pitching this to the platform engineers or if you're pitching it to the front end engineers and sort of why, how your thinking goes into
yeah.
that
So
decision.
uh, right. So when it comes to positioning, there are quite a few personas. Number one is a front end engineer. Actually, the first one would be an engineer. Yeah. Or a CTO or some sort of a leadership
Yes.
uh, role.
So you've got
And
the management type who's thinking about, oh, we got a problem here. I don't want my people messing around with this stuff. I want something off the shelf that's proven that they can just deploy and solve all their
yep,
problems. And he's
yep,
thinking about efficiency of the engineering team
yep.
and keeping people high level and very productive and not reinventing wheels, leveraging off the shelf open source, that type of thing.
Right, right. And an engineer, could be a front end engineer or could be a back end engineer.
Okay. And so the front end engineer is thinking something like, I'm going to have to stand up my own, I'm going to have to write my own back end for the front end.
Yep.
Or I'm going to be blocked on back end, right? Because people block. I think back end for the front end got its start when front end engineers were blocking on the back end, and they wanted to take
Yep.
matters into their own hands and sort of have more control over what their APIs were returning. So you've got that front end engineer who's probably feeling like either frustration that they can't get what they need out of the platform engineers,
Yep.
and they want to solve that problem. Or maybe they already have a backend for the front end, and they would rather not be spending their time writing this almost like glue plumbing code that's tying together all these different APIs and massaging the data and all that stuff.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
And then you
Absolutely.
got the backend engineer. Give me a peek into their mind. What are they thinking when they look at something like tail call?
So typically a backend engineer wants to build their own APIs. They build their APIs, their job is done. It's not, at least in their heads, it's not their responsibility to kind of now perfect it for that front end use case,
Ah,
right? Either you have a specialized team or the front end sort of should take that responsibility. But a backend engineer build that API, it scales,
so
it
they're
works
basically not my
perfectly.
problem, right? Not my problem.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yep. Yep.
So
Right.
maybe their mindset is, I don't want to have to constantly almost like degrade my pure, beautiful back-end API for the needs of the front end. I want them to solve their own problem. I don't want to be involved.
Yep. Yep. There's one interesting piece, which is, the GraphQL,
Yeah, explain
and
how that relates to tail call and also a solution in this class.
right. So you don't really need GraphQL to kind of solve this kind of problem. Basically, we've provided a DSL. It can compose APIs. It can help you express how you want to compose APIs and generate a unified endpoint. But GraphQL gives you a much better experience when you're consuming APIs. If you want to compare just the experience of consuming APIs, I would rank GraphQL as number one, REST as number two, and probably gRPC as number three. If you
Yeah,
want to consume a gRPC API, you can't hit a URL in the browser and just see what's there.
yeah,
If you want to use a REST API and you want to make a post request, again, you need a postman or some sort of a client that can make those kind of requests, and it's not that straightforward. You don't know what is the type of inputs that it's going to accept.
yeah,
There's a lot of ceremony around just making requests, which are post requests and put requests, right?
yeah,
In GraphQL, it's very clear. You exactly express what you want when you're making a get call,
yeah,
and you exactly know what the backend needs when you're making post call. Sort of in GraphQL terms, it's called as a mutation.
yeah,
Right? So the experience of consuming GraphQL, in my opinion, is significantly better than the rest of the
yeah,
protocols. But at the same time, building a GraphQL layer is extremely hard.
yeah,
And that happens because it's a very flexible protocol. So it's a query language.
yeah,
REST and gRPC are sort of like RPC protocols, but GraphQL is a query language. So you can query anything.
yeah,
So because you can query anything, it becomes extremely difficult to optimize. And that's one of the reasons you want to start thinking about a query planning solution.
yes,
For each query, we create a very specialized plan and we sort of execute that.
yeah. So it
Right?
sounds to me like GraphQL is an integral part of the solution, at least at this stage of the game.
Yep. Yep.
I think that's important to know because that's going to affect positioning. If you know that GraphQL is like the reason for using tail call now, then you're going to
Right.
talk about this solution in a totally different way than if you're just going to say, delete your backend for the front end, right? That's very vague, generic marketing. Delete your backend for the front end. It could be useful, but also it's not going to be specific enough. You're going to have to go all in on GraphQL for the time being, I think, to reach the right audience.
Um, at the same time, GraphQL is very new, right? So most of the management, they don't, they're not well versed with um, GraphQL, the benefits.
Yeah,
In fact, most people don't even understand how GraphQL works. They sort
yeah,
of get it in principle, but it's far more. I mean, the number of concepts in GraphQL are significantly more than REST and gRPC and all.
Yeah.
So it's more complex that way, right?
So
So and becomes a challenge when if your pitch is why don't you use GraphQL? That's a much harder pitch compared to okay, the whole story that I said. There's a gap between the
yeah,
two versions of the API. You need a solution between.
that's interesting. So that gets me to my next question in trying to figure out great positioning here, which is how many people who have this problem are aware enough of the problem they have to put in the right keywords into Google or GitHub? Because sometimes people have a problem, but they're not able to put it into keywords that would lead them to solutions. And in this case, it sounds like one potential problem might be they don't know that GraphQL is out there and available to help them deliver a solution to this. They're not looking for GraphQL stuff. They might not even be looking for anything at all. Or would they be looking for something? Is there some keyword or phrase they would type in if they're looking to delete their backend for the front end or not create it to begin with?
Um, Typically, they are looking for so generally what I've seen is they are looking they're searching for terms like backend for front end, aggregation
Okay.
layers,
All right.
composition
Let's write those
layers, those
down.
kind of things.
Let's write
Sure.
everything down that you think they're searching for.
Aggregation layers, uh, composition. They're searching for API orchestration,
Yeah.
composition.
That makes sense. Okay,
Right.
so these are what they're looking for. They might not, if what I'm hearing is correct, then they might not even think, oh, GraphQL could provide a gateway to us solving these problems in a way that's going to be good for the front end
Yep.
developers.
Yep. Yep.
So the typical front end engineer, are they going to be attracted or repulsed by the idea of having access to GraphQL, a GraphQL API, or are most of them going to say, I don't even know what that is?
Um, it's a hard question, but I think front end engineers would, I mean, if I have to make a bet, would prefer GraphQL once they use it.
And maybe we could put
Once you,
that to the audience. If you're a front end
yeah,
engineer and agree or disagree, then just type something in the chat there. Okay, so once they've tasted GraphQL, and maybe they have because they programmed against some Facebook API or something out there and had a great experience on the tooling side of things, then they're like, wow, this is a whole lot better than all these ad hoc, inconsistent REST APIs that have no sort of type information available other than Open API, which may or may not be up to date. Then they have a really great experience and they have a positive association with the act of using GraphQL. And then I imagine it might almost be flipped for a backend engineer, platform engineer who's building an API. They probably think, oh no, you want a GraphQL API? No, those things are impossible to make fast, et cetera. The typical sorts of concerns I've heard from platform engineers when they're tasked with adding one of these.
yep, yep.
Okay, I think we're making progress. I think one thing to know early on is that you got to pick your persona in marketing because the way you're going to talk about this solution is going to be radically different depending on whether you're targeting the front end engineer, the back end engineer, or the CTO sort of leadership. And a strategy that a lot of companies use when they have these types of solutions that appeal to multiple personas is they try to rapidly direct you down the right path. And you can do that with a website. You can like say, here I'm a back end engineer, I'm a front end engineer, I'm in management, and you click on that, and then you see marketing that's tailor made for you. But I think for a project on GitHub, we don't have the same ability to control the browsing experience of the person who visits this page. It's not like we can show them different pages based on their persona. So we're going to have to pick something. And I think that means that we need to tailor the positioning on the GitHub page for one of these specific users our personas. And maybe what we can do is we can hint that if if you're management, go to this website, or if you're, back end engineer, go here to learn more. We can direct them somewhere else in the documentation, either on GitHub or on the tail call website to help them better understand this. But in order to figure out which of these three personas we need to target on the GitHub positioning, I think it will be useful to understand whether it's the front end engineer or the back end engineer who actually has to use this product? Who is going to be defining this GraphQL API, adding all the different sort of annotations or directives, et cetera? Who's going to be the person who's using tail call? And is that different than the person who's going to be deploying it?
Yep. Yep. Typically,
Okay, so we've
front-end
got
engineers
separate.
don't manage infra.
Okay, so it's not going to be infra. Who is it's going to be a front end engineer who's actually using this solution, you think?
So what I'm seeing typically is in a lot of companies, front-end engineers do write the backend layers also, and
Yeah.
they are sort of simpler. Um, but obviously, they are consuming the APIs. That's
Yes.
100% there. But some of them might also write it.
Okay. And do you have any sense right now for the split? Like, would it be if we're thinking about like someone finds tail call, then there's going to be some like design and implementation phase that's going to be required to get your first API up and running on tail call. Is that going to be usually done by front end engineers, or is it going to be usually done by back end engineers? And what's the split? Is it 30-70? Is it 50-50?
It's going to be front-end, I think,
Okay.
and the DSL and everything sort of designed so that front-end engineers have a good time.
Okay. Fantastic. So let's think about more. I think what that tells me is the positioning on your GitHub README, basically. It needs to be targeted towards that front end persona, and it needs to have hooks to basically direct away people who are on the back end, people who are in management, and get them to some other marketing material that's going to be more what they need to see. It does make sense to me. People find GitHub projects when they are looking for something to use personally. They're Googling, they come across GitHub, they add GitHub in the title name, maybe they search on GitHub, they come across this project, they see that, and it's targeting them because they're the one that's supposed to be using this to deliver V1 of some solution in this space. So I think our README probably needs to target that front end engineer. Does that seem correct to you?
How can we sort of build more confidence about front end is the right persona? Because even if front end sort of does a prototype, you see
Yes.
everything, they eventually have to convince the backend engineering
Yeah.
team, and the backend engineer is going to come and say, "Do you have open telemetry integration,
Yes.
for example? Right? What kind of security features do you have? All those kind of things.
All
How
right.
does it
Yeah. So here's an idea. First off, I think if you sell the front end engineer, if it is true that like the V1 of something is going to be done by the front end engineer in most cases, if you sell them sufficiently, then all you need to think about is arming them for the argument they're going to have with the back end team and maybe infrastructure ops, et cetera. And that doesn't have to be done necessarily on the homepage. So if we really are convinced that it's in 90% of cases, it's going to be a front end engineer who discovers this project, who says, oh, yeah, this is really amazing, who gives it a try, who builds something, then I don't think necessarily it has to impact the way we position this to them on the homepage README of GitHub. On the other hand, if it's not going to be 90%, it's going to be more 50-50%. Or if we're not going to have the resources to develop separate literature, like, what I'm thinking in my mind is, right, there's a whole page devoted to why ops should love tail call, but another whole page devoted to why backend engineers should love tail call because they don't have to, I mean, they might have to be somewhat involved with it, but they don't have to constantly be changing their APIs to the needs of all these different front end teams across mobile and web. So I think there's a compelling pitches you can use for both of those audiences, and that would be, at least one page, maybe multiple pages of content, and you can use that content to arm and educate your champions, your advocates, who are going to be the front end engineers who are ultimately driving adoption of this solution. If that's true, then I think we can still focus the README. If you're not quite as sure about that, or you think we need to explore and experiment, what we could do is we could try a hybrid design. We can actually embed two marketing messages for two separate audiences inside the same page. I wouldn't do that for CTO and front end engineer because they're too different. But for back end engineer and front end engineer, they're close enough that we can like embed little things into the copy such that some things are going to be like, yeah, but other things are going to be like, yeah, that's why I want it. And I've used that technique before, and it dilutes the purity and the how compelling the pitch is for one
Yep.
market, but then again, it appeals to it appeals to multiple segments. So it's up to you which way. But I think this is our point to decide that. Are we going to go all in on front end, or are we going to try for hybrid messaging that's going to be maybe less compelling to any class, any persona, but it's going to have something in there for everyone?
I think if we focus just on front end, that gives us a direction, where we want to
Yeah.
move. It also helps us kind of figure out the set of features that we want to prioritize
Yes.
this way more clearly. If we focus on both, then the kind of prioritization we need is sort of very confusing.
That's right.
So
Okay. So let's think about. Actually, we have some comments here. Sounds like the same issue as functional programming. And functional programming has a lot of marketing challenges. How do you position FP? So I definitely see that there's some challenges there. Would be good if you try it. No thanks. Why not picking explicitly the full stack dev? So that's a question for you, Tushar. Why not say we're targeting the full stack dev?
because a full stack dev won't need product like this. They're building the front end, they were building the back end. So there's no coordination that is required. Right. So they actually build APIs for the front end they need. So typically in those cases, you might not need a layer of
That's
abstraction in
interesting.
between.
I think we should make a note of that, at least mentally, maybe here, which is that a full stack engineer, basically you're solving a coordination challenge.
Yeah.
There's coordination between front end and back end. You want to simplify or eliminate that coordination and unbottleneck, like, allow each to evolve independently at their own pace and for their own needs. And this layer of glue / coordination is not something you would need for the full stack engineer. That's a very useful insight. Okay, so excuse me. Let's think about, or let's write down actually. Let's write down some of the things a front end engineer loves about GraphQL, if they know about GraphQL.
Okay.
We know GraphQL is important to talk about and think about in positioning this. So we're looking for selling points of GraphQL to the front end developer, that persona that we're targeting.
I think type safety.
Okay. Would even the
Um,
JavaScript engineers love that, or is this just the TypeScript engineers?
Probably TypeScript engineers. JS engineers won't. I mean, it doesn't matter.
Yes.
Um, right. Also, discoverability of APIs.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that discoverability of APIs.
Right. Because if is this a real word? Anyways, so for example, if you're using REST API, I need to know on what are the endpoints on which those APIs exist. Right?
Yeah.
What is the what and maybe in a staging environment they're very different. In a production environment they're different. So that becomes a challenge. With GraphQL, there's one unified endpoint, right? So it makes it much easier to kind of work with.
Yeah.
Um,
How
I
about
think
what's like the postman of GraphQL? What does the like high level tooling story look like around GraphQL? Is there
I think
anything?
Apollo GraphQL, which is basically a JS library. Right?
Okay.
Um,
So this is the postman of the GraphQL world.
yeah, you could say that. It's just a library, pure JavaScript library that
Okay,
allows
so
you to
no
build a
front end
GraphQL.
interface. Okay. Are there any sort of other high level tool sets that you could use for introspecting on an API in some sort of visual fashion or executing fake queries and mutations or timing such things? Is there any sort of tooling that a GraphQL developer might be familiar with and really love?
So there's something called as a graphical, I think, graphical, which is basically an IDE for GraphQL. It's an open source IDE. Everybody uses the same IDE.
Okay.
And that basically, I can actually show you how it looks. Um, it's sort of like this, right? So you can write your query on the left and you can get some sort of responses on the right.
Yeah.
And this is what everybody is sort of using. So this is the IDE that allows you to specify the queries, the parameters, play around with your GraphQL endpoint. You can specify endpoint here, there, just mess around.
Okay.
But this is a very small
So
piece, and it's an open source IDE to kind of work with.
so you embedded it directly in the tail call playground.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's call this IDE, IDE and tooling, right? It's sort of mature IDE and associated tooling.
Yeah. And this Apollo GraphQL has tons and tons of plugins. Right? So you can do
Oh,
basically anything with this library.
okay.
It's a fairly large ecosystem.
And this contrasts with uh, REST APIs. I don't think, I mean, does something like this even exist for? I don't think it does because every REST API is different.
I mean, literally speaking, GraphQL graphically is essentially the Postman for
Okay,
REST.
okay,
Like literally speaking, because
yeah,
Postman is the IDE for REST.
yeah. All right, all right. So that makes sense. And let's see. Let's. I think this is great. I can't think of anything else, but type safety, discoverability. We've got a sort of standard JavaScript library with a ton of plugins into it that can do anything you want. So that's open source ecosystem, and then we've got tooling, which is IDE. So I think this is great. It's all the stuff that a front end engineer can and should love about GraphQL. Now
There's a
let's
few more
go ahead.
things actually,
Oh
if you
yeah,
don't
go
mind,
ahead.
right?
Yeah.
So there's efficiency. Because now I'm just making one call to get everything. It's significantly more efficient.
All right.
Imagine a set of
Yes.
sequenced calls, right? So
Yes.
I call foo, which calls bar, which calls baz. If I do it on the
All
client,
right.
which is on a low
Yeah,
bandwidth, it's expensive. So this
that's
becomes
right.
extremely efficient,
So,
right?
basically, this notion of efficiency is not it's not tied to like CP or network per se. It's low latency responsive user interfaces. Because the front end engineer, they care about like you click and you instantly see a response. So it's like super responsive. It allows you to build interfaces that users love. And that's going to be something to get the front end engineer excited. The front end engineer is probably not excited about saving CPU or memory in the cloud on their cloud system. That's more like for ops or back end engineers. The front end engineer, they want that super snappy, responsive UI that this is going to give them. All right, keep
And the
going.
last would be flexibility, right? So the ability to just query anything
Yeah,
gives the front end engineer a lot of flexibility. Because when
yeah,
the UI changes, product manager comes and says, just move this box here or to the next page.
yeah,
The network calls have to change dramatically, right? So
yes.
that flexibility is available with
All
GraphQL.
right. That's fantastic. I love that. The flexibility being we are in the world of the front end. The people are constantly adding new features, requirements are constantly changing. And in order to cope with that, we don't want to have to, because in a way, like REST APIs are not compositional, they're not modular. And if you change the business requirements enough, the solution doesn't look anything like the old solution. The new solution doesn't look like the old one. Whereas in GraphQL, you just change your GraphQL query. And then, the
Exactly.
hard parts of sort of getting this data together and joining it and whatnot, they happen on the server side, out of sight, out of mind. You don't even have to
Yep.
deal with that. Okay, I like this. This is good. I think we'll clean this up in a moment. But first, let's talk about what the front end engineer hates. A separate list here. Stuff the front end engineer hates about backends for the front end. They can solve this problem themselves. They know that in some percentage of cases they do, just by standing up their own node API that ties together all these different sources and does API orchestration. What do they hate about that path?
I mean, a backend for front end should basically mean that's in service for that front end engineer, right? So
Yeah.
I'm, I'm, I don't know if they really hate it because it's basically for them, right?
Yeah.
Mm,
Okay, let's think about this differently. If they don't use tail call, and if the platform engineers don't solve their problems for them, what's the do-it-yourself solution look like for the front end engineer?
Handwrite code, everything, and handwrite the orchestration layer.
All right, so let's refactor this one to be whatever the front end engineer hates about do-it-yourself. about handwriting this orchestration code on a mobile device or in a browser. And if it's just mere images of the other ones, then we'll end up deleting them, but maybe we'll see something new here.
Yeah. So there is just slowness, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And is this slowness of like a high latency, not responsive UI, or is this just it takes me a long freaking time to do this to get anything done?
Both. But here I was actually talking about just responsiveness,
Okay. All right.
right? Reusability is a big problem,
Yeah.
right? So actually no reusability
Yeah.
and complexity with caching, patching, all those kind of things.
And
Just
let's
the
I like this, but let's think for a moment. Why is this complexity something that a front end developer wants to avoid? Is it just takes me more time? Is it complex? Is it boilerplate? Why do they hate this?
because it's driven by back, so the ability to cache is not something that the front end team can know,
Yeah.
but they still have to manage it.
Okay.
The ability to batch is not something the front end team can kind of try. But
Yeah.
if the backend team says, for this call, do not make separate, if for this API, do not make separate calls, use this batch API, otherwise you produce a DOS attack on my system, will
Yeah.
go down. So then they have to manage it in the SD.
Yeah. So it's really like incidental complexity that arises from the needs of the back end team being misaligned with the needs of the front end.
Yeah. That's the impedance mismatch, right?
Yeah. Okay. All right. That makes a lot of sense. Is there anything else we would want to add to this list?
Um, Actually, there's no reliability. I don't know if it should be a separate point, but reliability is lower. The whole system is unreliable. Every time you make a change,
Yes.
um, so typically the front ends, let's assume it's a mobile app, you can't just make a quick fix and release. Right?
Okay.
It's a mobile app release.
Yeah.
If it's an Apple app, it takes like a week to kind of reach your users. So if you messed up your orchestration logic,
Yeah.
it's not very easy to kind of fix it. Right?
Okay.
So having lower reliability has very high cost. So you say, for example, you started not caching something,
Yeah.
missed, you set the cache limits to be too low.
Yeah.
All those kind of things can just massively have an impact up on
So
the upstream.
so it's not just low reliability, it's almost volatility. Because the needs of the back end and front end are not aligned, it's extremely volatile. Some back end engineer goes in and changes some config thing somewhere, and suddenly your finely tuned, highly user responsive, performant front end application does a nosedive, and that affects metrics that matter to the business. So it leads to volatility that degrades the user experience that the good front end engineer is so passionate about.
Right, right. There's also just the number of, you know, just maintaining backward compatibility
Okay, which
is
so
a big problem.
basically high cost, the high cost of
Yeah,
maintaining backward compatibility.
yeah.
And would this be a cost borne by the front end engineer?
Typically on the back end, actually. This is not a
Okay,
cost by the front engineer, yeah.
so
But
let's move
on
this
this is the
down
back end.
lower. Yeah, let's move this to a separate list. I think the volatile architecture is something that the cost of that's borne by the front end engineer because it's the back end engineers constantly screwing around with stuff, changing the performance characteristics of the front end.
Yeah. One of the very a great example is, we started off with the monolithic architecture. The front end is using those APIs, everything was
Yeah.
great. But now the backend team has decided to move to a microservices architecture.
Yes.
Nothing to do with the front end, but the whole front end needs a revamp now, right?
Yeah.
Every release, the front end is not delivering features; they're just
Yes.
rewriting this orchestration layer. So
Yeah.
that's a big problem.
It's a bit like, tail call is, I don't know if you've heard of this from like the Gang of Five, but like the facade pattern, whereby in order to decouple two systems that are each evolving independently, you introduce a facade. And the facade pattern allows these to evolve independently without the tight coupling that results in extremely high costs of maintaining both sides of that equation.
Right. Yep.
Okay, so I think this is great. we should spend a little bit of time. This is not going to feature prominently in this marketing, but I think I think we would still say something to the front end engineer about this, and that is why is tail call going to be easier for them to sell to management and to back end engineers? And I think the way to think about this is sort of the high level points, the high level bullet points that a front end engineer might use to say Telecall is definitely the solution we want to standardize on. So can you think of things that the ops team would love about Tailcall? What would ops love about Tailcall? Or if there's nothing like that, there might not be anything like that. Is there basically nothing to hate about tail call, right? It doesn't make their life more difficult in any way. So there's no significant reason why someone in ops would push back against tail call.
Yeah, I think this, from an ops point of view, this might be a black box. It just gets an API, fans out, fans in, and sends back the response, something of that sort.
But all ops might also be thinking, oh no, one more system to maintain.
Right.
How are we going to
Yeah.
scale this? How are we going to monitor it? How are we going to? So if you can say, hey, we scale with Kubernetes, or we scale with something else, or we have open telemetry support, or we plug into Datadog, or basically
Sure.
convince them that adding this new piece to the overall infrastructure they're already having to maintain and monitor and scale is not going to significantly complicate their life, and that could be useful.
Yep. Open telemetry is there. Performance is something which is critical, and we've been working on it. So
Yes.
you use less machines, it's easy to scale. Works on, it's edge compatible.
Okay.
Which means you can deploy it on, say, Cloudflare or Fastly, kind of anything. What I meant was actually WASM. It's WASM compatible.
Nice.
You can actually even run it on a mobile device.
Wow.
So
Nice.
you could use the orchestration layer deployed on a browser and just run it there. So you could
Nice.
do that. And so that makes it, and of course, it supports all cloud platforms. There's nothing about it. It's just a Rust binary. So you can deploy on GCP or AWS, or
Yeah.
anything that you're using.
Okay, so cloud neutral, basically.
Yeah.
And ops will care about that. Ops will be thinking, is this compatible with Google Cloud? Or is this compatible with whatever I'm using?
It's also stateless. It doesn't use any state internally.
Yeah, nice.
So that makes it easier.
Yeah. Okay, and stateless would mean basically easy scalability. The benefit of statelessness is easy scalability.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's think about this for the backend engineer. Again, these two areas are not going to be very significant in this type of marketing, but you'll develop them into whole separate pages, I think, on the tail call website at some point.
Sure. So for backend, number one, they don't need to maintain this layer.
Yes.
Right. So it's because tail call is config based. The configuration can be auto generated. Right? So we could auto generate config based on Postman collections, or Swagger endpoints, whatever.
Yeah.
Or say gRPC protobuf files. So because that makes it much easier. So you build your perfect API and you expose a Swagger endpoint. We can automatically just keep polling on the Swagger endpoint and generate the config for you.
Yeah.
And it could be a huge config. It could be like 5,000 lines of config.
Yes.
You don't have to read it. It's auto-generated, and you can apply links, and you can merge types. You can do a lot of governance sort of operations on the config itself.
Yeah. Okay. And I like that. I think this is an essential point. There's something I'm thinking of, but I don't have a way to I don't have an obvious way to break it down into something that's more fine-grained, but this idea of appealing to the back-end engineer's desire to be left alone. Give the front end the customized APIs that they want without having to do anything yourself. Or even something like build your APIs in the way you think is best, and the front end team doesn't have to, you don't have to compromise your back end APIs for the sake of that mobile app that's running on Android. There's something
Right.
along that the lines of like let them solve their problems and you just build the best stuff you know how, that I'd like
Right.
to find a way to distill into some points here on this list if you have any
Let me
ideas.
actually expand on this a little bit, right? Like the config, the backend team doesn't care about the config. The config could actually be in the same repository as your front end code. And when
Oh,
you make a
okay.
front end deployment, whether it's a mobile app, Android app, or a web app, there are two parts that are getting deployed. There's the mobile app, which is going on, say, the Play Store or the Apple Store. But at the same time, for that version, you're also making a deployment on a set of servers.
Yeah.
So you're sort of version controlling both of them,
Yeah.
right? And the backend team doesn't need to care. And because the front end team has so much such tight control over the config, they can maintain it. They can run lengths of APIs that are not being used. At compile time, you'll have all that information. So you
Yes.
could do a lot of interesting work there.
Okay. So really this auto generate config is even better than auto generate. It's like don't generate, let the front end team do it.
Yep.
Potentially. Obviously some teams might choose to engage with that or be forced to engage with that, but it really is self-service from the
Yep.
perspective. So there is a point here about let the front end team solve their own problems, right? It's
Yep.
it's don't compromise your back end APIs for the sake of the front end team. I'm not sure exactly how to solve that, but I do think we should make some sort of note along those lines. We're going to have a one sentence in there that is going to speak to a selling point that a front end engineer could use with a back end engineer. What would be the reason a back end engineer would say no, no freaking way? Or
Because they
like,
don't trust.
okay, they don't trust.
Yep.
They don't trust the, would this be like maybe tail call would end up hammering their APIs, not doing caching and resulting in, massive overloads. Maybe it would be making too many calls, something like that.
Yep. Yep.
Let's deal with that trust issue because that could be a reason they push back and say, no, you shouldn't be doing this yourself. You shouldn't be using tail call because you're going to cause us more problems and more headaches by using our perfect APIs inappropriately.
Yep. Yep. So trust is a problem of how you use the tool, which is basically Tailcall, right? Like you could use Tailcall in a way which is detrimental to the overall performance of the
Yeah.
infrastructure.
Yes.
But the interesting thing is because it's a config, you can apply a lot of lengths and you can apply a lot of
Yeah.
checks.
Yeah.
So you could fix a reasonable amount of build, a reasonable
So
amount of trust.
let's
Yep.
think about counter arguments for that trust argument. The trust argument is, I don't trust you. The front end engineers are going to destroy my back end APIs. Our counter argument is we can introspect, we can tell you performance characteristics. We can apply quotas and limits. We can automatically do caching. It's all the stuff that helps establish trust in the back end engineer. The lints, yes. What else?
So you can lint the config. So these are all compile time, So this is even
Yes.
before you start the server, you
Yes.
verified and check the config. You can
Yep.
disable N+1, you can disable fan outs, you can put some batching limits and stuff like that, right?
Okay.
You could control authentication, all those kind of things at lint level while
Yes.
linting the config.
And
That's
overall, the backend engineer would be concerned about, I think, two things. Are you going to degrade the performance of my backend? And also, bypass, are you going to introduce security issues with your use of the backend?
yeah,
So we should maybe write that down. If those are the two things they're concerned about, is that persona is concerned about performance degradation and security vulnerabilities.
yep,
And so when we work to establish trust with that segment, we're going to be focusing on all the features that tail call has, which allow you to maintain high performance, as well as to um, provide secure authentication and authorization for these GraphQL APIs.
yep.
Okay, this is good. And we still have a couple more minutes. Let's think real quickly about just because I think this is really solid. I'm beginning to understand, I think, tail call much better than I did before, and I have more background than most since I'm an investor. But I think what could be useful is to just write down a couple points for the managing persona, the CTO, the CIO, the director of engineering, whoever is taking a look at this and maybe evaluating this. Why should they care? I think I have the answers in my mind, but I would love to hear your take on that.
The primary problem is going to be dev productivity
Yeah,
that they've sort of focused on, which is basically hampered because of coordination
yeah.
issues and
I
reliability
really like
issues.
that, and I think that's going to appeal to, lots of people in a management role in the organization. Just the fact that there is a bottleneck, and that's the coordination overhead, communication overhead. It's a communication bottleneck, communication and coordination bottleneck, and that you're trying to delete that, and that could be very significant, I think. Okay, what else? Anything else? Is there like a story that you can tell around if you let your developers do it on their own, who knows if you're going to get observability out of this and how
Yep.
long it's going to take to get perfect observability. But if you plug in tail call, boom, it's 100% transparent observability over front end and back end stuff that you get for free.
Yep. 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 So sort of like an end to end,
Yes.
tracing that is
Yeah.
available.
Okay. What else would that persona care about?
So I feel performance brings in a lot of
I think the
cost
CTO is
imperatives.
like, yeah, exactly. Is supposed to be thinking about cost as well, infrastructure
Yeah.
costs.
Yeah. So infra costs are significantly lower because it's faster, it's Rust, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Run it on serverless. A lot of companies are starting moving from just dedicated Kubernetes infrastructure to serverless now, and
Yes.
a lot of times they have challenges around what kind of services can they run on
Yeah.
serverless, right? So this becomes an added advantage.
Okay, that's fantastic. I think that's enough because we only need a little bit for the back end engineer and the CTO, unless something else pops out. For purposes of doing the sort of positioning and marketing for the front end persona, this is probably all we need. Let's real quick take a look at, since we're a little over time, but let's real quick take a look at the homepage of Telcall
Okay.
using our new sort of tool set here. Okay, so API platform engineered for scale. Okay, so we've got the scale there is an attractive characteristic for ops
Yeah.
probably, right? And then we have tail call as a high performance, and high performance is a little bit ops, but also it's the CTO persona because the CTO is thinking, is this thing gonna live up to the load? Is it gonna cost me an arm and a leg? Open source API orchestrator. Okay, API orchestrator. Trying to think. That's probably more in the line of thinking of the front end engineer because they're like, oh, I have to call these if they're on their own. If they're do it yourself, then that's probably more targeting that front end engineer. And
Yep.
then enables organizations to construct unified data access layers. So unified data access layers. So that's that's probably the front end engineer. Unless this is an internal project, that's probably the front end engineer who's thinking I need an API I can call to implement all the stuff I need to implement. And then on top of existing APIs, there's a little bit element of the backend engineer, I think, in that. It's like you have your existing APIs, you don't want to touch them, you don't want to tailor them to the needs of the ever changing needs of the front end. So you want to build something on top of what already exists. And CTO as well. That's a CTO pitch. On top says non-disruptive. We add to what you
Right.
have. We don't take away. You don't have to change anything you have, just add more to it. And that sort of pitch appeals to the CTO who's thinking with their business hat on all the time.
Yep.
Okay, so this is the top level pitch. Let's scroll down a bit and just see what's here. Okay, this is the like give me a peek at what it looks like. Show me what this is. I'm an
Right.
engineer. I want to see what this is. Okay, scroll down. And then you have credibility section down here with all the logos saying you can trust us. Where traditional gateways fail. Okay, so that's something maybe we can talk about next time real briefly, is how tail call relates to an API gateway and whether or not the front end engineer will even be thinking in terms of API gateway. Will they think, I need an API gateway to solve this? Or will they not even think about that? And that's going to affect how prominent it is in our marketing and how it relates to our overall positioning.
Right.
And then anything else on this page? You've got something down below, it looks like. APIs, not
So
pro.
set of features that we sort of listed
Uh-huh.
down at a high
Okay.
level. So we
Mm-hmm.
say orchestration, just the
Yes.
governance bit.
Yeah.
We briefly covered it through that linting technique. Talk about efficiency, do a lot of ahead of time optimizations. That
Okay.
gives you pretty significant efficiencies.
Yes.
We have an embedded JavaScript runtime. So if the
Yes.
DSL doesn't support something, you can extend it with custom code written in JS
Fantastic.
and many more features.
Yes. I think maybe next Friday we can take a look at this and try to produce our sort of new marketing and positioning for the front end engineer. I can tell that there's some lessons that you've learned that are embedded into this. This is not a random stab in the dark. This is an educated, informed take at positioning this. But that said, I think with the amount of material we produce today, we can probably go in next week and we can produce something that's really going to connect to that front end engineer even more. They're going to see that and they're going to be like, I need this right now because it's speaking my language. It's talking about pains I have. It like overcomes all the objections anyone in my organization might have. I think we can come up with that. And I think we can do that in just one more session.
Awesome.
All
Fantastic.
right. Well, thank you for bringing this very interesting problem. It's not coding, which I like because building open source is about marketing and it's about positioning and figuring out who you're targeting and why they should use your stuff. And of course, there's plenty of coding stuff we can take a look at later, like query planning and performance optimization.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks so much, Tushar. See you next Friday.
Thank you, John. See you. Bye
Take
bye.
care. See you, everyone. Bye bye.